Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the DC Science Assessment Accessibility Features and Accommodations webinar training. My name is Annette Thacker-Bartlett, and I work on the Training and Technical Assistance team here at OSSE in the Teaching and Learning Unit, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Ms. Nikki Stewart, who is a member of the Division of Data, Accountability, and Research, and who has been doing quite a bit of work with the science assessment here at the state level this year. We're excited to have you here today for this training and appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule. Before we get started, just to do a quick sound check, if you can hear me okay, please type in your chat box. Also, throughout the webinar today, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. We will do our best to answer your questions as we go along, but if we are not able to answer them during the webinar, we will stay on the line after the webinar to continue to answer those questions, and we can send follow-up emails as well. The purpose of today's webinar is to get you familiar with all of the accessibility features and accommodations that are available for the science assessment. Now, as you know, this is the first year that we are assessing the students in the District of Columbia on the next generation science standards, which is very exciting. This is a brand new assessment, and this year it's a learning year, but it also is very exciting because it's our first year. So in today's webinar, we're going to do a review of what accommodations and accessibility features are available for the science assessment. You will notice several similarities to what was available for the PARCC assessment, and there are a few differences that we are going to point out. We are also going to remind you when it's necessary to amend an IEP and when it's not necessary. We will also talk about accommodations available for English language learners. Then we're going to look at the test administration, planning and scheduling, and how you need to plan ahead for that, some tips and tricks there, and talk about how it's the same and different as to PARCC test administration. And at the end, we will talk briefly about the personal needs profile and what you need to do to update that or edit that from what it was for PARCC to what it needs to be for science. First, let's talk about accommodations and accessibility features in general. As you know from giving the PARCC assessment, there are different categories of features that are available. Some features are available to all students, including students with disabilities and students without disabilities, and including English language learners. Those are called accessibility features. Some of those accessibility features do not need documentation of any kind. That's because they just exist as they are. I'll show you some examples of those in a minute, that there are tools available for a student to access if they feel the need to during the assessment. The second group of features are accessibility features that have to be identified in advance, and you do that on the personal needs profile. And this includes a group of features called administrative considerations. And the last group of features is called accommodations, with which you're pretty familiar. These are for students with disabilities, which means they either have an IEP or a 504 plan, or the accommodations might be designated for English language learners who have an ELL plan. And with this particular population of students, of course, they have to be documented in their plan as well as in the PNP if the PNP asks for it. Here are a few examples of these different groups of features. The highlighter tool, the answer eliminator function, the line reader tool, those are examples of tools that are available in the testing platform that a student can access at any time. You do not need to make that decision ahead of time of who gets this and who does not. Also, repetition of directions. This is an example of an accessibility feature. It's not necessarily something that's built into the testing platform. Rather, this is a feature that the test administrator can use at their discretion to help certain students who need it. There are a few features that are identified in advance on the PNP, For example, answer masking, you would check that box on the PNP. And then administrative considerations, such as frequent breaks or small group testing. Now, those administrative considerations are not things that are built into a testing platform. Rather, those are features that you provide to students as needed, but we do ask you to document them on the personal needs profile because it's great to have that historical documentation of the testing conditions that each student had. It's very important for that. And some examples of accommodations for a student with an IEP or 504 plan might be the human scribe, a calculator, or extended time. Again, these are just examples. This is not the full and comprehensive list. An example of an accommodation for an ELL student would be a word-to-word dictionary or extended time. Now, the available accommodations and accessibility features that you saw for PARCC, all of those are not available for science. Many of them are, but not all, and we'll make sure to point out those differences as we go through the webinar. Because there are differences as well as similarities to PARCC, we have developed a crosswalk resource which is currently available on OSSE's website. The hyperlink is here. The first part of this crosswalk goes through each accessibility feature and each administrative consideration and each accommodation that is available on the science assessment, and it compares it to what it was called for PARCC, and it also compares it to what it might be called in the SEDS system if it's for a student with an IEP. I will show you more detail about this crosswalk in the next couple slides. Let's talk more in depth specifically about students with disabilities. There are 4 groups that can receive accommodations on the science assessment. And again, this is a refresher as you've already thought about this in previous statewide assessments. You have your students with IEPs, your students with 504 plans, you have your ELL students, and you may have students who are both ELL and have a disability, thus qualifying for both sets of accommodations. In this section, I'm going to focus on students with IEPs and students with 504 plans. So here is an example of what all of the things you need to do to prepare to provide accommodations for a student with a disability. Let's take Joey. He has an IEP. The first thing that happens is the IEP team makes decisions about what accommodations are appropriate for him and documents them in a finalized IEP. Without documentation in that finalized IEP, it is not appropriate to provide accommodations for Joey. And again, there may be accessibility features available to all students that do not require any type of documentation, but in this situation, we're talking specifically about accommodations for special populations. Once they're in the IEP, the test coordinator ensures that any accommodations that need to be marked in the PNP are marked in the PNP. And then the school test plan is developed to make sure Joey is actually provided those accommodations on the day of the test. Julie is a similar student. She also has a disability, but she does not have an IEP. She has a 504 plan. Similar to an IEP, Julie's team makes decisions about the accommodations and documents them in Julie's 504 plan. And then just like Joey, they are captured in the PNP. And just like Joey, the school test plan includes provisions for Julie to get her accommodations. Now, I want to point out, as I've mentioned again, there are actually very, very few accommodations listed in the personal needs profile. And I will show you a picture of what the personal needs profile looks like for the science assessment, and you will see that it is much shorter and smaller than the PNP for PARCC, because that's good news. That's less work for you. Here's a snapshot of the crosswalk that I mentioned earlier. This snapshot of the crosswalk is showing accessibility features available for all students. Several of these features are actually not in SEDS, and this is the same for how it was for PARCC as well. They're not all in SEDS because not all of them are considered accommodations in other settings. And remember that for this set of features. Even students without disabilities can utilize these. And you will see here from this crosswalk, some have a place to document in SEDS and some do not. Here is the portion of the crosswalk that focuses on those 6 administrative considerations for all students. Historically, in other school years, these have only been available to special populations. But this year, as you know from PARCC, these features are available to any student who needs them, and that decision is made on a case-by-case basis at the school level by people that know the student. And as you can see here, all of these show up in SEDS to be marked on a finalized current IEP. Now, there are some differences that arise when it comes to accommodations. Even though the science assessment is administered on the same testing platform as the PARCC assessment, a lot of the accommodations that were built into the PARCC system are not available for the science assessment. So if a student needs one of those, then you will go ahead and provide an equivalent accommodation for that student. And by that, here is an example. If you look at the bottom of the page, if a student was prescribed speech-to-text for the math assessment in PARCC, the speech-to-text feature is not available for science. It is not built into the test platform. So you would provide the equivalent accommodation of a human scribe or external device to ensure that the student still received an accommodation with the same level of support. And again, another example at the bottom of this page, if a student had a response assistive technology device that was built into PARCC that is not available for science, you would use an equivalent accommodation. Now you can see in SEDS, when you document it in SEDS, it is a little more broad. It has sort of a running list of the different modalities of the same type of accommodation. So you do not need to amend the IEP. If they got text-to-speech on the PARCC and now they're going to get a human reader on science, you do not need to amend the IEP because it's the same type of accommodation. It's not changing fundamentally what the student is receiving. There are some accommodations that will not be available for this year's version of the DC Science assessment. These are pointed out in the crosswalk, and here you will see some examples. A screen reader is not available, refreshable braille display, hard copy braille edition, tactile graphics, large print, etc. These are not available, and so it will be important for you to look at this crosswalk and see, okay, what can I provide the student instead that would be a very similar accommodation. Here's a case scenario. Jessica received the text-to-speech accommodation for the PARCC assessment. She still needs this accommodation for science, but it is not available. What should you do? Well, you will provide Jessica with an equivalent accommodation to text-to-speech, such as human reader. And you can find out, you can use a crosswalk as your guide if you need it. Should Jessica's IEP be amended? No. The current accommodations selected in SEDS will suffice, even though the modality of the read-aloud accommodation differs between PARCC and DC Science. Again, it's the same accommodation. It's a read-aloud accommodation, even though the delivery of that accommodation looks somewhat different. Here are a few frequently asked questions about IEP amendments when it comes to the science assessment. What if Joey has his IEP meeting at the beginning of May, after PARCC is over and done, and new accommodations have been added to Joey's updated IEP? What do? Well, you're going to need to update the PNP because what's in the PNP is left over from the PARCC assessment. So you're going to have to update that to capture those new accommodations. And yes, you need to provide them to Joey for the science. It doesn't matter if he did not receive them at the time of PARCC. Since he's had an IEP, since his IEP has changed, you're obligated to provide anything that his new and current IEP says he should be getting. Question: what if Joey's team decides tomorrow that he needs an accommodation that is not listed on the IEP? Well, if he truly needs it, then you're going to need to amend the IEP using the proper amendment process. Now, as you know, there are two ways to amend the IEP. You can either have a meeting or not have a meeting. If you don't have a meeting, of course, you have to do the proper documentation of that, which all of you are probably very familiar with. So if Joey needs it, and if you're going to be allowed to give it to him, you're going to need to add that to the IEP through the proper channel. Question: what if Joey's IEP says that he gets a paper and pencil assessment? Well, unfortunately, a paper version of the science test is not available this year. So you're going to have to provide similar accommodations to try to provide the same level of support. Perhaps a human reader or human scribe might be needed. In this case, the IEP does not need to be amended in the situation. You should leave the IEP as saying paper and pencil assessment, because that's an accommodation that he will need to get on assessments where that is still available. And again, use the crosswalk as your guide should any questions arise. And also feel free to reach out to the assessment team if you have certain situations that you're unclear about in this type of scenario. Here is a snapshot of what the PNP page actually looks like in Pearson Access Next for each student. When you're thinking about a student with an IEP or a 504 plan, I've highlighted here the actual sections of the PNP that will need to be filled out for them. As you can see, you have the administrative considerations, a few accessibility features, and a few timing and scheduling accommodations. And that's it. That's the only part of the PNP that you would need to pay attention to if it's a student with a disability. Now, of course, they could have more accommodations that they need to be provided that are documented on their IEP or 504 plan, and they need to receive everything there or something equivalent. But with regards to what the PNP is capturing, it's a more narrow scope. Now let's talk for a few minutes about English language learners. Here is an example of a student with an ELL plan, Ava. Similar to how you treated the situations for Joey and Julia earlier in the webinar, for Ava, the first important step would be for the school team to make a decision about what is appropriate for Ava to receive. And similar to PARCC, not every ELL student should be receiving all of the ELL accommodations. You need to look at the level that the student is at. Are they a beginner, intermediate, or an advanced English language learner? And choose the appropriate accommodations accordingly. The PARCC manual on accommodations can actually be quite helpful in thinking through this, and hopefully you've already made all the decisions about this as you made those decisions for PARCC. And the second step, of course, would be to mark in the PNP any accommodations that pop up in the PNP. And then, of course, the school test plan needs to make sure that Ava will get her accommodations. This means that you need to find extra staff to be on hand for test administration or extra classrooms, etc. You need to plan ahead for that. Unlike PARCC, the science assessment for this year is not available in other languages, and that includes the general administration instructions. Everything is only in English for this year. So for those students who need assistance in understanding the directions for the test, here are some things that the administrator can do. They can read the instructions out loud in English. They can repeat the instructions in English. They can clarify the instructions in the student's native language. So this is as close as we can get to supporting the students that need this accommodation due to their ELL status. Here's a snapshot of a page in the crosswalk that shows you what to do in this situation where the student needs the directions read aloud. As you can see here, it points out that the directions are not available in other languages, but you still are able to clarify them in a student's native language. So please plan ahead for that and have somebody who is able to explain those directions in the languages that are needed. And what's different from the PARCC in the science assessment instructions are actually pretty brief. There's not pages and pages of instructions that the test administrator is going to have to spend a lot of time reading out loud to the class. Rather, the instructions are pretty brief and they're on the computer screen when a student logs in to begin the test. With regards to other ELL accommodations, some of them that were available on PARCC are not available for science, but some are. Because the test is not translated into other languages, you are not allowed to have any translator translating ad hoc at the time of the test. We need to preserve the validity of the test. So while you can provide some supports to English language learners, you're not able to have somebody sit there and try to translate the questions and the answers that are the substantive part of the test. So for example, if a student received a text-to-speech accommodation for the math assessment in PARCC in Spanish, or if they had a human reader in Spanish for the PARCC math assessment, this time they're not going to be able to get that in Spanish. So instead, you're going to try to provide as close as you can of a similar accommodation. You would do a human reader in English and also provide them a bilingual word-to-word dictionary as needed. Another example would be speech-to-text or a human scribe. This is not available in Spanish, but you are still allowed to provide them a human scribe as needed, but it will have to be in English. So the student will have to dictate their response in English, and the scribe will transcribe that in English. Here are additional ELL accommodations shown on the crosswalk, where you can see a side-by-side comparison with PARCC. The first two listed here, extended time and word-to-word dictionary, will be the same. The online and paper-based assessments will not be translated into any other languages for this year only. And again, there's no paper edition, so you're not able to get any large print. Here is the picture of the PNP and what it looks like online. I've highlighted here the part of the PNP that you would fill out specifically for an English language learner. And again, if there is an accommodation that is not captured on the PNP but still listed in their plan, you still need to provide that to the student. Again, the scope of the PNP is more narrow than the full range of accommodations and accessibility features available. Now I'm going to turn the time over to my colleague, Nikki Stewart, who's going to lead us through the last two sections of today's webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks again. I want to join my voice to Annette's in thanking you for joining us for this webinar. We are very excited about this year's DC Science Assessment. It's the, you may or may not know that it's the nation's first statewide assessment of the next generation science standards. And so we are very excited to be a part of this historic moment in assessment. Okay, so now let's talk about considerations for test administration, planning, and scheduling. So it's time to get everything organized and get ready for test administration. You probably know that we have a broad test administration window from May 18th through June 19th. It's about 5 weeks. This year, and you can schedule the DC Science Assessment flexibly within that 5-week window. So in order to get ready, there are a few steps that you need to take. Okay, the first step is that you need to verify your student registrations in Pearson Access Next. We were able to export your PARCC EOY student registrations and place them into DC Science registrations inside of Pearson Access Next for 5th grade and for 8th grade. Additionally, we used biology rosters that were submitted to OSSI in the fall and loaded those students also into Pearson Access Next. So while most of that data is from PARCC EOY, it should be fairly up to date. It's important that you still go in and verify that your students are registered properly for this assessment. You may have had some students leave your school. There may have been a few changes in student information or 1 or 2 errors in the system for them for PARCC. So just go in and take that first step and verify their registrations. Next, and this is the part that's most relevant to our webinar today, you will need to review and edit students' PNP information in Pearson Access Next. As Annette mentioned, there are fewer accommodations available for DC Science than there were for PARCC. What that means is that for 5th and 8th grade, when we moved students' PNP information over from PARCC EOY to DC Science, any accommodations that were in for a student for PARCC that are not available for DC Science, those accommodations did not transfer over with those students' records. A great example of this is if a student had text-to-speech. Text-to-speech is not available on the DC Science assessment. So if they had text-to-speech in their PNP for PARCC, it is not in their PNP record for science. You will need to substitute that accommodation with an equivalent accommodation, human reader. But you need to go into their new PNP and actually select human reader, because with that data transfer, it wouldn't be there. So it's very important in reviewing and editing the student's PNP information that you first crosswalk the student's accommodations for DC Science. That's really the most important part, that you are crystal clear about which accommodations are not available, and that you've ensured that students receive an equivalent accommodation. And then to make a special note, for high school biology, there is no PNP information entered. Students who are taking high school biology may or may not have been registered for a PARCC assessment this year. And so the PNP files for high school biology are empty. You will need to do the PNPs from scratch, but we know you have lots of experience doing the PNP for both PARCC PBA and EOY. All right, so now that you've verified student registrations and reviewed and edited PNP information, the third step is to create your testing schedule. You will need to submit a school plan addendum to ossi.assessment@dc.gov, and it's very straightforward. We don't need a lot, but we do need your test schedule for science. That addendum needs to be submitted 10 days prior to the start of science testing. And then the fourth and final step to prepare for DC Science is that you will need to set up your test sessions in Pearson Access Next. All of the students in a grade in your school were loaded in one test session. So if you're a school that has 5th grade and 8th grade, right now in Pearson Access Next, unless you've changed it, all of your 5th graders are in one test session and all of your 8th graders are in another test session. In order to parcel those students into their actual test administration groups, you will need to go into Pearson Access Next and create test sessions. Now, yesterday, there was a webinar on how to manage student registration and also how to create and manage test sessions. And so the recording of that webinar will be on the OSSI website later today. All right, so Annette walked us through the crosswalk, and I want to zero in now and really look at those accessibility features and accommodations that are the same and those that are different. Of course, those that are different are the ones for which you will really need to think carefully about how to ensure that students have an equivalent accommodation this year. So first, let's look at accessibility features that are the same for PARCC and for DC Science this year. Answer masking was available for PARCC, and it's on DC Science. And all of these features, let me say, for DC Science, you don't need to turn them on. They will all already be on. So no student needs to be assigned these features. All students will have access to them automatically. Blank paper, which you will provide to students. The answer eliminator tool is available to all students. Flagging items for review. The highlighter tool. Headphones, noise buffers, which again is something that you would provide externally. The line reader tool. And the magnifier. Those will all function in exactly the same way as PARCC. There are accessibility features that were available for PARCC that are not available on the DC Science assessment. Audio amplification is not available, however, you can use your computer's volume control. Color contrast is not available for DC Science. The notepad is not available. The pop-up glossary, not available. As we mentioned earlier, text-to-speech is not available, but you can use the equivalent SEDS accommodation of human reader. And writing tools are not available. There are constructed response items on the DC Science assessment, so students will be typing into an answer box, but the word processing tools, bolding, italicization, those features are not present. I'll also say that those features are not needed for the purposes of responding to these constructed response items. Moving on from accessibility features to accommodations. These are the accommodations to specially note because they are not available. They were available on PARCC, but they're not available on the DC Science assessment. And so we will delineate here, as well as in the crosswalk, the equivalent accommodation for this year. For text-to-speech, you'll use a human reader. For built-in assistive technologies, you will need to use either a human reader or scribe or an external assistive technology device. For screen reader, you will need to use a human reader. While PARCC had a built-in calculator, DC Science does not, so you would need to use an external device, a calculator, a separate calculator. For speech to text, you can use a human scribe or you can use an external device. Braille and tactile graphics, you will use a human reader. Braille writer and note taker, you will use a human scribe. And keep in mind, there is no paper version of the DC Science assessment. That's driving a lot of what you're seeing here. Large print, you will be able to use the magnifying tool inside of the assessment or a human reader. Additionally, you can increase the font size up to 5 times inside of the assessment. And then you can, on top of that, use the magnification tool. And then if a student has a paper-based accommodation, again, there is no paper version of this assessment, then you can use a human reader or scribe. Okay, so considerations for planning and scheduling, and this is a bit of a recap. There are no paper forms. This is the big difference between PARCC and DC Science this year. There are no paper forms. So most of the accommodations that you would have done on paper, you have to think about how those would be, the equivalent accommodation would be administered by a person or by a device. external device. For DC Science, you will see, based on the previous list, that there will likely be a much heavier use of human readers for you to consider. And that definitely impacts the way that you plan and schedule this assessment. Similarly, you will likely have a heavier use of human scribes, human signers as well. And you will need to consider the places where you will need to have an external device, because things like a calculator or a notepad will not be built into the platform. Okay, so as you continue to consider what you need to do to be prepared for test administration, the heavier use of human readers and human scribes in particular really calls for additional training for your individual and small group test administrators. So these are recommendations from AAFs. For your human readers and human signers, these are things that will be helpful for your test administrators to know. The first is that DC Science has minimal test directions. If a student has an accommodation to have more than directions read aloud, it's different, and they certainly will have, test administrators will have access to all of the text for reading to students. But the test directions themselves for science are fairly minimal. It's imperative that test administrators stick closely to the text, that they read exactly what's there. And again, this is because you will be using human readers for a broader range of accommodations this year than normally. And then finally, human readers as an accommodation will need to read data tables and graphics. In doing so, it's important that they know and get some practice reading images and tables literally, and that they refrain from inferences when reading tables and graphics. Human scribes, very similarly, human scribes should type exactly what a student states, and this assessment is not assessing literacy skills, so it's just imperative that the human scribe doesn't try to correct or change students' text, but they type exactly what the student states. And then also, keeping in mind, as I mentioned just a moment ago, that constructed response items are not testing literacy. Okay, so one of your key tasks, as we discussed, will be reviewing and editing the DC Science Personal Needs Profile. The Personal Needs Profile for DC Science functions a little bit differently than it did for the PARCC assessment. For the PARCC assessment, the Personal Needs Profile was the primary source of documentation for students' testing conditions, including their accommodations, and it was for planning and for historical purposes, but it also turned certain features on and off in the testing system. That's different for DC Science. For DC Science, it is how you record the accommodations that a student is receiving, the accommodations or accessibility features. For those of you who were involved in administering DC CAS, we know that accommodations were bubbled on the back of the test booklet at the end of test administration. That was the record of what accommodations a student received. The Personal Needs Profile is serving that purpose for DC Science. It's letting us know the accommodations that a student has received. So unlike PARCC, for DC Science, the PNP does not generate forms or assign student materials. It doesn't turn on accessibility features. All of the accessibility features that students will have access to are already on, and every student who takes the assessment will have access to those features. And it does not turn on accommodations. So let's look a little bit at the Personal Needs Profile, and this is very much a recap, I'm sure, for most people, because everyone has used Pearson Access Next. to register students for PARCC, and that's whether you took the paper-based assessment or the computer-based assessment. So here's a screenshot of Pearson Access Next. When you log in the top right corner, you will see, and you can see my arrow, my cursor here, you will see District of Columbia. This area here where you have selected either PARCC EOY or PARCC PBA, there's now an additional drop-down that says DC Science. And we're looking at screenshots here, so I'm not showing you the real view, but right here where I'm pointing, it drops down and now says DC Science. In order to access the personal needs profile, once on this landing page, you go to Setup and then Students. Once you're inside Students, and you'll see Students here in the blue bar, under Tasks, you go to the drop down and select All Tasks. Okay. This is where you would begin the process of changing a personal needs profile. Because you selected all tasks, you will have access to all of these windows. These are tabs here where you can do different tasks related to a student's record. You want to make sure that the student's registration information is correct, and that would have come over from Pearson, as I mentioned earlier. There's additional demographic information that you collect here. And this is a recap, so we're doing this very quickly, but there are other OSCE webinars on accommodations and accessibility features in Pearson Access Next that we will point you to for a longer overview of this process. And then in managing student tests, this is where you will see the personal needs profile. So if you come over to this tab 4, Manage Student Tests, you'll get this screen. And this is where the PNP officially starts. Scrolling down on the Manage Student Tests page in a student's record, you will see the beginning of the PNP. Now I wanted to just show you the PARCC PNPs. You should be very familiar with these now. And as you can see, there are 2 different screenshots here of the PARCC PNP. It's been quite a detailed process to make sure that you get the PNP for every student correct. The PNP for DC Science is much shorter than the PNP for PARCC. There's less information to be captured because there are fewer features available. Okay, so let's go through a couple of case scenarios to just see how this looks in action. Kang is a 5th grader who had small group testing and a human signer for PARCC. These accommodations are not available for DC Science. So what will we do for Kenya? I'm sorry, these accommodations are available for DC Science, both the small group and the human signer. So her PNP information was transferred from PARCC EOY, should already be in Pearson Access Next for DC Science. And so no changes would be needed to Kenya's PNP. On the other hand, D'Angelo is an 8th grader who had text-to-speech for PARCC. This accommodation is not available for DC Science. So since the PNP for DC Science contains no option for text-to-speech, that information did not transfer over into D'Angelo's PNP for DC Science. What would you need to do? You would need to look at the crosswalk and determine that human reader is the equivalent accommodation, and then you would add human reader to D'Angelo's PNP. This just shows you where that would be done. Here where it says human reader, human signer, it's a drop down, and you would select as accommodation there. A special note for biology. And I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to really underscore this. biology student registrations were not entered from PARCC EOY data, but from rosters that were submitted to OSSI in the fall. So that means that extra steps probably need to be taken to verify student registrations in Pearson Access Next for biology. Additionally, there is no PNP information that has been entered for bio students. So if you are a high school administering biology, you will need to do the PNPs for your students from scratch. Okay, so there are two different methods for creating personal needs profile file or PNP file for students. Oh my goodness, sorry about that. Just 1 second. Okay, the first way to do it is to through a file import. In this way of doing it, you use a CSV or Excel file and import all students' PNP information at once. The other is through the user interface. We've often called this doing it manually, where you can go into each student's record and adjust their PNP information. Now, OSSI has already featured step-by-step a webinar that included step-by-step instructions on how to do both types of PNP, and here is the link for accessing that webinar. This webinar will be archived on our DC Science Assessment website, so you will be able to access this link at any time. But in the PARCC Accommodations and Accessibility Features webinar that gives step-by-step instructions for how to complete the PNP either manually in an individual student record or by use of a file layout. In that webinar, I'll give you a tip. Go to 35 minutes, the 35-minute point inside of that webinar, and that is precisely where the step-by-step instructions for doing the PNP begins. And it is our webinar from December 3rd, 2014. Okay, so finally, there are resources that are available to help you in the administration of DC Science. First, Pearson provides the following resource. There's a toll-free DC Science hotline. The number is 1-866-688-9555. And this call center is available from 7 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday. It's important to note that this is a different call-in number than the number for PARCC. It's a different number. And it's got slightly different hours. The PARCC number opens at 6 a.m. and this number opens at 7 a.m. Now, they are aware that we are, the PARCC folks are aware that we are administering a DC Science assessment through Pearson as well. And so if you accidentally call the wrong number, they will help you get to the right number. But it is a good idea to jot this number down. Also, if you are more of an emailer than a caller, you can also email that call center at dchelp@support.pearson.com. We also have support for you here at OSSI. The OSSI assessment team is here to support you, and you can reach us by emailing ossi.assessment@dc.gov or calling us on our assessment hotline, which is open from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, and that number is 240-270-2598. Lastly, just want to let you know that there is a dedicated page on the OSSI website for a DC Science accommodation, for DC Science assessment, I should say. And so inside of the DC Science assessment website, there are links for accommodations related materials. There's a link to the accommodations and accessibility crosswalk that Annette shared with you, as well as this link that says Accommodations Science Webinar. We'll have a recording of today's webinar. Okay, we have a couple of questions that we want to answer for the full group. Are there parts of the test that require students to listen to video? Meaning, are headphones necessary for everyone? There is video on the assessment. However, the video is closed captioned and there is no sound, so you will not need headphones for everyone. Will all students need a calculator? The answer is no. All students will not need a calculator. Only students who have a calculator accommodation for all statewide assessments should be provided with a calculator. For human reader, will the test administrator get a separate login to read from their own computer? The answer is yes. For human readers, test administrators will get a separate login. Okay, well, we are going to stay on the line and continue to respond to your questions that are submitted in writing. We'll be writing responses to you individually. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Stay cool out there.